Before we get started, I just want to quickly apologise for the bad audio quality in this video. It turns out my microphone was picking up a lot of static that I didn't notice whilst recording, so now my voice kinda sounds a bit muffled from where I had to remove it in post. So just a heads up before we begin. Hello again, and welcome back to another episode of Adding Game Sounds, where today we're going to look at our FMOD Studio lister component. We're going to add a second one, and we're going to try and see if we can switch between the two so that we get two different perspectives of where we can hear our 3D audio from. Before we get started, I just want to let you guys know that the FMOD and Unity Essentials course is now available, and it will be until the 7th of February at 11:59 p.m. 2020, that is. Yeah, if you're looking to improve your audio skill set, then this might be the best course for you. It will give you all the essential tools you need to learn how to use FMOD's API inside of Unity, and through a step-by-step process, taking things nice and easy from the beginning of the basics of C# code all the way to some more advanced stuff using FMOD specifically. This might really benefit you and improve your skill set. So if you want to learn more, check out the course via the link in the description or in a card in the top right corner of this video, or you can just email me. I'll be happy to answer any questions you have. But until then, let's jump back into the 2D game kit we're messing around with today and look at those audio listeners. So originally, when we started implementing audio into this game, we attached our FMOD's Studio Listener component to the player game object. And the idea was that whenever a 3D sound was played in the world, during whatever scene, you'd hear the audio from the perspective of the player. So if anything was playing a sound to the left of the player, you'd hear it in your left ear. And obviously, if it was playing to the right, you'd hear it in your right ear. And of course, the further away those objects were as well from the player, the lower in volume they'd be heard. So we'd apply a distance attenuation to give, well, a sense of distance. And that worked fine. That worked really well, in fact, until we got to this scene here. So there's, including the start menu, there's 6 scenes or levels in total. And the one we're on currently is Zone 4. Now, in Zone 4, there are cutscenes. I think there are some cutscenes as well, or there's one cutscene in Zone 5. And these cutscenes, they're rendered in real time. All it is basically, once the player triggers an event to happen, usually by pushing one of these crates into a trigger box, for example, there's one here in this hole, what's going to happen is the player's going to lose control of the character, and the camera is going to follow that box and show significant points of interest, right? So it's like a little mini cutscene. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to say, okay, if that happens, if the camera's going to move around the scene, we want to then hear audio from that perspective. So instead of just the perspective of the player, we now want to hear it from the perspective of the camera as it moves around the scene. The reason why is because if we were still listening to the player's perspective, we'd be hearing sounds that the player could, or Ellen in this case, could kind of technically hear, but we couldn't see because the camera had moved. So what we had to do was instead, for this level only, is take the Studio Listener component away from the player and attach it to the camera. And that worked, but I noticed recently that it's kind of a bit awkward. For example, because the camera, let me quickly click off of 2D here. So because the camera, as you can see here, is actually a bit of a distance on the Z-axis away from everything else, all of the audio that we had created suddenly sounded too far away, because obviously we had set like things like distance attenuation and 3D panning. We'd set that all in relation to the player. And so that led us to do things with our actual events in FMOD. Now, since then, I've actually gone and made some tweaks, and I'm going to recommend these tweaks for you to make as well. But let's take an attack sound. So what we had to do to compensate for that distance issue is we'd change the min and max distance of the distance attenuation to quite high values, to usually about somewhere between 10 or 15 and about 20, roughly like that. Problem with that is, however, we're using these audio events in other scenes. And remember, in other scenes, there are no cutscenes, or for most of them, there are no cutscenes. And we had the Studio Listener component, again, attached to the player. So now we needed audio to be heard in relation to the player again. Problem is, we've changed our max and minimum distance attenuation settings, and now it all sounds too close. So long story short, I kind of screwed up, basically. So the plan to fix this permanently is we're going to, instead of using just one Studio Listener component and kind of switching it between objects, we're going to permanently add 2. We're going to add one to the player and one to the camera. And what we're going to do is we're going to essentially turn one off and turn the other on when need be. So let's dive into how we're going to fix this. First things first, I want you to go through your hierarchy tab, and this goes for every scene as well. Start zone 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Go through all of them. And I want you to find all of the objects that have studio listener components already attached. The reason why I'm saying this is because we want to make sure that we completely remove them, just so we're not getting any issues later on. So just make sure you've gotten rid of all the studio listener components. We're going to start again from scratch. Now, if I click on Ellen here and click on the audio listener, which is where I've got a studio listener component attached, let me talk you through how to remove it in case you've added it to the prefab. So if you haven't added it to the prefab of Ellen, which is like the original file stored within your game's folders on your computer, that the game can then pull and spawn in each level, like a copy almost. What you have to do, if it wasn't added to the prefab, all you have to do is right click it, hit remove component, and it'll be gone. But if you did add it to the prefab, you should notice something like this: Studio Listener script removed. Now this means you've removed it from this sort of copy, this instance of the player object in this scene. However, it still exists on that prefab. So whenever we go into other scenes, it's going to load in that copy of the player object with the component still attached. So to fix this, we're going to right click it again, hit remove component, and this time we're going to hit apply to prefab Ellen, the player object. And now it will be completely removed, both from this copy of Ellen and from the Ellen prefab. And that goes for the camera as well. So I think in that original video where we added the component to the camera for the cutscenes, we added it straight to the main camera object. So again, scroll down, find it. Oh, I actually don't have it attached to this, but if you do, find it and remove it. Okay, now that you've removed all of your studio listener components, we're going to add two. We're going to add one to the prefab of Ellen, the player character, and we're going to add one to the main camera, and that will be it. So whenever we're in a scene, both of those objects are going to be loaded in with a studio listener component. So let's first add one to Ellen, the player character. So go to your project tab, just type in Ellen, and you want to look for an object that looks like that. Just kind of a grey background with Ellen's body in it. And if you click it, you can tell it's a prefab file because at the bottom here, it tells us that it's ellen.prefab. Once you've found it, click open prefab, and let's add that listener component. So I'm going to add it to audio listener because remember, this was a Unity game using Unity audio. So as you can see here, they added their audio listener to that. So yeah, it makes sense, doesn't it? So I'm going to add component, FMOD, where is it? FMOD Studio Listener, this is the one. And I'm going to add it. What I then want you to do, and this depends if you have the option or not. I don't for some reason, but if you have the option to set the listener index here, I want you to set it to 0, or just make sure it's on 0. What the listener index is basically a label, essentially. Once you've got multiple studio listeners in your game, you want to label them with an index. So by labeling them with a number, we can identify them within our script. I don't know why, but for some reason, I don't have the option to change the studio listener index. I tried working this out. I have no idea why. If that happens to you, don't worry. What's basically going to happen when the scene plays or when the game plays is it's going to assign a number for you. Now, this is optional, but originally I found that the game object, audio listener, was for some reason by Ellen's feet, and I thought that was a bit weird. So I just increased the Y value on the position, the transform component, and brought it up to her head. Once you've made your changes to the Ellen prefab, go ahead and hit Control S if you're on PC or Command S if you're on Mac, I think, to save your Unity project and make sure the changes to that prefab have been saved. Right, next we want to find the prefab for the camera. So again, go back to Project. We're going to type Camera, and we're going to find the prefab. This is it here, this blue box. Again, we can see it's called main camera.prefab. So let's open it up. Now, this is our camera object here. Now, we could attach the Studio Listener component, but like I said earlier, the camera is going to be positioned, and you can see it here, at 13.5 units away from the rest of the objects in our scene. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to right-click camera, hit create empty object, and we're going to call this, you can see I've already done it, so I'm not going to do it again, but we're going to call it FMOD Studio Listener by changing its name there. Then what we're going to do is select that object, and we're going to change its Z value to 11.5. Now, let me explain why. The camera is minus 13.5 units away from everything else in our game. All of the objects that are going to be emitting a sound. All of our objects are set to 0 on the z-axis, right? So what we're going to do, again, because we don't want we don't want to listen to everything from this perspective because that's going to screw with distance attenuation. So what we're going to do is we're going to add, or you've already added it, but because we've added that extra game object as a child to the main camera, by adding 11 units or 11.5 units back to it in the z-axis, you can see that that actually brings it forward. So what we're going to do is attach the studio listener component here so that it's closer to all of the sounds. Not only is it closer to the sounds, but if I click on Ellen, you can see Ellen is set to 0 on the z-axis. But if I then click on audio listener game object, which is what we've attached our first studio listener component to, you can see that that's actually pulled as well. And that is 2 units away from all of the objects on the z-axis. So if I click back on the FMOD Studio Listener game object I've already created, you can see that it's on the same level as the game object, the audio listener game object attached to Ellen. So now both of our 2 studio listener objects are on the same plane, on the same level on the z-axis. So they're going to be hearing things in terms of distance attenuation anyway, from the same amount of distance. So when we make changes to our events in FMOD, it's safe to, because we know these distances will be calculated for both listeners. Then all you have to do is click Add Component, add an FMOD Studio Listener, and this time I want you to set the listener index to 1. So the first one's set to 0, that's its label. Now this one's going to be set to 1. And again, if for some reason you can't set yours like I can't, don't worry, we're going to find out what ours are, well, now really. Final thing I want you to do is quickly create a new C# script. And well, you can call it what you want. I've called mine FMOD Listener Fader, and you want to attach that to the FMOD Studio Listener game object that you've created. So just go Add Component, come down to New Script, click on that, then enter the name you want to call this script and hit Create and Add. And then bang, we've got a new script which we'll be able to edit later. Once you've done that, just right-click it and click Edit Script, just so you can load it up in Visual Studio or MonoDevelop so we can dive into it later. Once that's all done, just double check you've saved your prefab by hitting Control S or Command S again. Then let's go back to our scene by clicking that little arrow. And now we need to find out what indexes our listeners have been labeled with, in case yours is like mine and for some reason you can't choose them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the FMOD Studio Listener game object that we've created. I'm going to keep an eye on it. Actually, what I'm also going to do is make sure I've got access to the audio listener attached to Ellen as well. Then all I'm going to do is play my scene, and we're just going to look at what index they're given. Okay, cool. So you can see that for the camera, the index has been set to 1. And if I go to audio listener, the index is set to 0. Perfect. So when we're gonna start interacting with these listeners, 0 is going to represent the listener attached to our player character. 1 is going to represent the one attached to our camera. Brilliant. Now that we know the index of our studio listeners, now it's time to check that script out. So what we're going to do is open up the script. Hopefully, like I said, you've already opened it up. And you're basically going to want to add all this code to it. And I'm going to explain to you what it all does now. Okay, so the first line of code we've got, which is happening in our start function on the very first frame that this game is run, or any scene is run really, we're using this function here, set listener wait. And we access that function by writing fmod unity.runtime manager.studio system.set listener wait. And then we give it 2 numbers. Now, what does set listener wait do? Well, every studio listener component has what's called a wait. And you can imagine the weight of a listener component as kind of like the mix of it. So the weight is a value that is between 0 and 1. And it basically represents how much audio will be heard through that listener component. If it's set to 1, then you'll hear all your audio in FMOD. Let's go back to FMOD. You'll hear all of your events at full volume, or rather the volume you've set them to, right? Just normally heard. If you set the weight of the listener to 0, then you're going to hear nothing. And anything in between will obviously vary. So if we set a listener to 0.5, then we're going to hear all of our audio at about half the volume that we've set it to in FMOD, okay? So the plan for this script is that we're going to set the camera's volume, or camera's weight rather, to 0 when the game starts, and the player's to 1. Then once we trigger those cutscenes, we're going to switch that. We're going to switch the player to 0, and the camera to 1. So instead of listening to everything at full volume from the player's perspective, we'll hear it from the camera's perspective. Now, by default, all studio listener components are going to start with a weight of 1. So when we start this scene, both the player and the camera's listeners are going to be set to 1. So we need to change that, obviously. That's why in the start function, what I've done is I've said, okay, I want you to set the camera listener component, which remember has an index of 1. So that's how we access it through these functions. We want to set that to 0. So now the camera won't be able to hear anything, but the player will. Then we've got 2 custom functions I've made, which we're going to trigger in a little bit. I'm going to show you how. First one is called switch to listener 0. And you can call that whatever you want. It doesn't really matter. And what this is going to do is basically turn the camera's listener weight to 1 and the player's to 0. So we're using that same function, set listener weight, and we're saying, okay, I want you to turn the camera, again represented by the index of 1, turn the camera to 1 so that we can now hear everything from the camera, and then do it again. This time we want to set the player, which is 0, to 0, so the player can't hear anything. So now as the player, this is going to be triggered when the cutscene is activated. So now as we follow the camera, we'll be hearing everything from the camera's perspective. Then we've got another function here. This does the exact opposite. Once the cutscene ends, we want to switch back to the player's perspective. So camera, we want to turn back down to 0 so we don't hear anything. But the player, represented by 0, set it to 1 so we hear everything from the player's perspective again. By the way, you can also copy this script from my website, which I'll have linked in the description or with a card in the top right. Once you've copied it either way, go ahead and save your script, and let's look at how we can trigger those 2 functions we've just created. Now, back in our scene, you may remember when we last did this that we discovered that the cutscenes are activated by trigger areas, so we need to find them. What I'm going to do is I'm going to type in my search bar here inside the hierarchy tab, cutscene, or just cut, that should do it. And here we are, we've got 2 triggers for 2 different cutscenes. So I'm going to click on the first one, and as you can see, it shows us what the trigger is. Then I'm going to come down to the director trigger, and this is the script that basically starts and stops the actual cutscene and the movement of the camera. And what do you know? Luckily for us, it has Unity events, which we've used before. They're really nice and easy, and they allow us to trigger public functions from any script or any class and any game object in our scene. So what you're going to want to do, where it says on director play, you're going to want to add a new action for it to trigger when the cutscene starts. You're going to want to find your camera object that has our FMOD Studio listener component attached to it with our new script. Then with the cutscene object selected, you're going to want to drag that object into the object box here. Then you're going to want to select the actual function we want to trigger. So what we're going to do is click on no function, find our script, FMOD listener fader, then we're going to find the function we want to trigger. Now for us, because the cutscene's starting, we want to switch to the camera's perspective, which is obviously index 1. So I'm going to trigger the switch to listener 1 function to run. Then you're going to want to do the same for the on director finish event. Click the plus button, drag the FMOD Studio listener object into the box, and then select the other function. So this time, switch to listener 0, which is going to switch the perspective from the camera back to the player. Once you've done that, go ahead and save your scene with Control S or Command S. Now there's one final thing for us to do. Go to Project, then in the Assets folder, select 2D Game Kit, Scenes, and then click on the Start Scene. Now in this scene, neither of our objects, being our camera prefab and our player prefab, are loaded into this scene because it's just the main menu. What they've done instead is they've just created a one-off main camera object in its place. Now, whilst you probably won't be adding many 3D audio to this scene anyway, we're just going to make sure it does have a listener component attached. So I'm going to go to the main camera, add component, and add one more FMOD Studio listener. With that, we should be good to go. We've now got all of our listeners covered, and in a nice, neat way, we could switch between them when needed. Now, the last thing you have to do, and this is a bit of a pain, and this is all my fault because I screwed this up in the beginning, is now that all of our listeners are going to be quite close to our 3D objects, in fact, the max distance they can ever be is a unit of 2, we need to change our distance attenuation for all of these events. So yeah, thank you very much for watching. Hope you're enjoying jumping back into adding game sounds like I am. And yeah, I hope you find that helpful. Again, when it comes to the FMOD and Unity Essentials course, let me know if you have any questions about it at all. I'll be happy to answer them. And don't forget, there is only 4 days before it closes. 11:59 p.m, 7th of February, 2020, Eastern Standard Time. So yeah, as always, I've been Henry Scott. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.